Go.
Okay, so welcome to this session, which is a kind of a tutorial about how to make your models available for your future self, which is actually might be one of the most important targets as I've experienced. We like to have it as a tutorial, so we will give some brief presentation, but also like to address questions of you. So we start with Michael Barton providing a context, then I will talk about what has been done, also how journals start to change requirements, and we'll also give a demo with how to archive a model on ComSysNet. Then Alan Lee will talk about getting credit for all this extra work and that it is still not enough, containerizing your model. And then Michael Barton will talk about a broader effort, Open Modeling Foundation. And well, I don't know how we will keep to the time, but at least we want to have enough time for having some discussion. So we will have a buffer of 30 minutes for discussion afterwards. But I will now give the floor to Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Marco, and I want to thank Marco for organizing this session.
You may share the screen if you want.
Yeah, I'm ready to do that. Marco's organized this session, and I guess I'm going to try and start out with a little pep talk and give a little bit of history and maybe some vision about what we think of the modeling of the future might be, and why it's important, and maybe mention some of the issues that we'll be talking about later on in this workshop, in this working group here, or tutorial. So the Earth is a coupled human and natural system, and maybe that seems obvious, but if you look at a lot of scientific work, it may not be quite so obvious. But really, to kind of put this in context, I'm a historical scientist, archaeologist by training, so I think of time maybe a little bit differently than many people, and so I say things like a few short millennia. But in this short period of time, in a few millennia, we have transformed. Our species has changed from being a normal creature on this planet to being a really unique global phenomenon. There's now over 7.5 billion humans on the planet, up from 1 million only around 10,000 years ago or so. And over half of us live in these massive urban hives we call cities. Again, this is really atypical for any vertebrate on the planet. On top of this, we have now digital media, rapid transportation that connect all of us economically, socially, culturally, sadly, epidemiologically, in this planetary network of multiple cross-cutting ties and interactions. This is a highly complex social and natural system, and it's unprecedented for any organism in history. And if we have some difficulty in trying to manage it and work it out, we need to cut us a little bit of slack, because no organism has ever had to do this ever. And in this kind of a world, dominated by these rapidly changing telecoupled processes that we have to try and understand, we need to somehow expand our vision from the traditional studying and understanding the immediate social and natural world around us to try and manage the dynamics of an entire planetary socio-ecological technological system. And this is, again, something that no one has ever done before, no humans. And so we really need to leverage our abilities with advanced information technology to help us meet this challenge. And so by the mid-20th century, people started developing mathematical and computational tools to try and represent these dynamics of the processes that affect our planets, and they've been really important. They have leveraged our intuition in new ways and given us insights into processes that we could not understand previously about things like the climate and oceans and ice and things like this, but they're now facing growing limitations. Modeling is a critical tool for representing these dynamics of human and natural systems. But many of the models that are out there today don't account for the interactions between these systems appropriately. There's an emphasis on modeling natural processes, as many of you know in this society. And when we model human processes, they're usually modeled separately from biophysical processes without the feedbacks that we know would happen. Many of the models that dominate the world today are increasingly large code bases, big piles of Fortran that have accumulated over decades, and that in truth, no one really understands how they work. They're difficult to use, requiring specialized knowledge, often supercomputers, and they're only accessible to first world countries often, and specialized research institutes. They depend on proprietary black boxes where no one really has the algorithms. And these are hidden from scientists and policymakers with, I would say, a lot of bad repercussions. And increasingly, these large models don't have the flexibility to represent the kind of systems at multiple scales and address issues that we face today. And so a grand challenge for our time is to try and grow scientific modeling infrastructure to understand these interactions between humans and biophysical components. To that end, a number of meetings were organized beginning in 2015, organized by multiple scientific networks that represent modelers, just like ESSA does, societal, ecological, and geophysical systems. AIMS, analysis, integration, and modeling of the Earth system, part of Future Earth. ComSysNet here, Network for Computational Modeling of Social and Ecological Sciences. The Community Surface Dynamics Modeling System, we're kind of some of the leads in this, but not the only ones. And this is just a list. There's a series of these workshops that took place over several years to try and talk about what's the future of modeling. And, pardon me. And so these are some of the questions that were addressed. How do we integrate modeling human and biophysical systems and do so in flexible ways across scales? But also, how can we go beyond the kind of first world large research institutes to incorporate different conceptual approaches to modeling that take advantage of knowledge across the globe? How can we create models that are resilient for questions that we don't know yet, not are trying to answer questions of last year and the last decade? And importantly, how can we democratize this modeling technology that's really important to everybody in the world, not just a few, and make it widely accessible to a global community? And so how do we start to create a scientific agenda for doing this and build new capacity and build from current technologies and do better, but not, not lose the legacy systems that we've already built? In these meetings, kind of a consensus vision emerged of a future of integrative modeling. It's a shift from the current approach of these monolithic, all-encompassing code bases or singular one-shot, one-off models to an evolving ecosystem of potentially interoperable models that could be connected together flexibly and adaptively to represent the kind of diverse and challenging, changing challenges that not just we face today, we face in the future in this integrated human and earth systems that we live in. And hopefully this could encourage and especially enable broader input from a global scientific and stakeholder community and make modeling technology more accessible across the world. To do this, we need to change. The modeling community needs to change what we do. We need to shift from our current focus on building models to answer a particular question, research questions that we have, or our research institute has, to developing models designed for use by other people. So model code needs to be accessible and discoverable by other people, other scientists, other stakeholders. It needs to be understandable and reproducible by other people through sufficient documentation and other kinds of technologies. We need to leverage technologies like containerization as part of this tutorial today to try and make models reusable more widely. And also we need to think about common APIs that can link models together in new ways, but in ways that are widely understood and can be applied. This includes, and this involves common protocols, common ontologies for how we specify things in models. And these practices need to be followed across many different scientific domains. It's not just good enough that social scientists or physicists or geoscientists do this. It's got to be across these things because we need all of our expertise to understand this world we live in. And importantly, the kind of technology that we talked about today is important, but it's not sufficient alone. We also have a social challenge of collective action to try and find a way to get many people to start to adopt this new way to think about models, to develop modeling for the future. And so that's why I got this here. That's how I want to get this launched off. I think that maybe there's time for a few questions, Marco. I don't know.
Yeah.
And I'll stop there, and because I want to try and keep this on time. So thanks much.
So let's see whether there are any questions.
I can get to the button up here to stop the share. There we go.
If not,
just a practical question. Was I the only one that just kept the first slide and didn't saw the rest of the presentation?
Yeah.
You didn't see the presentation?
Well, I noticed. Yeah,
no.
There were more slides than the first slide. So we
yes, there was a whole batch of slides in the first slide.
Yeah. So
I mean, it doesn't matter. I mean, they pretty much emphasized what I said. We need to make sure that this is known so that normally this works, and so so I'm not sure what the problem is.
I do have a question though.
Yes, sir.
When you were talking a little bit about like I would say inclusiveness of modeling and computer science. But of course, when you talk about documentation, replication, and common IPS, it still leaves certain part of the population out. You still have to get some leverage, and like not leverage, but you still have to get some knowledge in order to access this information,
right?
Use it. But then my question is, how do you imagine a way of making it also usable for the people that don't have this level of knowledge, like the commons, the people that are not like they are suffering, the vulnerable population? How can we share this information with them?
I think there's two parts to that question, and one is how do we make technology accessible and available, and opportunities to learn if people want to learn how to use it, right? So it's not locked away in a specialized institution. But that doesn't mean that I think trying to say, can we make complex models of socio-ecological system so easy to use that anybody can intuitively use them if they can play a game? I think that's a different question. And that's saying, well, can we make science so easy that people without any training can do it? Unfortunately, the world right now is full of a lot of people who think they can do good science without learning anything. And I think that's not a good thing. And so, so the second one is, I think, more a question of how do we better communicate what we've learned? And so can we make technology accessible to people who want to know how to use it and can? And then can we communicate better those things from that work? And the idea, as some have had, when we started this project, ConsciousNet, can we make models so easy that anybody can do it? And the answer is, well, maybe, but if you do that, then you lose the ability for the models to tell us anything important. And there is a place for games as a way of teaching, but that's not the same thing as scientific models. And so we've shifted our focus to try and make models understandable, accessible, and usable, but not to make them available to an untrained, uneducated person. You know, we need meeting in the middle on this. Thanks.
Let's see whether there's one final question for this stage. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, so, and we'll keep an eye on it. If the next person that talks, I don't know if it's you or Alan, if you have multiple slides, say so, and I'll keep an eye out to see if we can see them or not.
I use another app, so I will have see my slides when I have only one screen.
Okay.
So I will now talk about what has been done in terms of sharing code, and I'll also explain why we are doing that. then there is the field is changing in terms of requirements by journals and sponsors. And I think being an editor-in-chief of a journal myself, we see a lot of confusion among the authors about what to do. And so I will address that. And then I will give a little demo of archiving a model in our library to get an idea of what steps are involved. So there has been a lot of calls of people say we have to share the code. There's a reproducibility crisis also in computational science. Some people, which is interesting, say you can, don't be afraid to share your code. It's good enough, because a lot of us may feel a little bit uncomfortable by sharing our code. As part of the ComSysNet activities, we approached some sponsors to fund our work, and they said, yeah, but there is already GitHub, so there's no need for what you are doing. People are already doing this. So that's why we start looking at what are people actually doing. And this has been a kind of an effort for a few years. So other people have been exploring this too in different fields about what is actually happening. And it's not a very positive, but there are some positive signs. We see some positive changes. So we created a database of what the results I show now are from 7,500 publications, which have agent-based or individual-based modeling in the keywords or abstracts or title. And of course, that's only a snapshot of what is out there. The database is available on the ComSysNet website. And we looked at, this is a kind of cleaned up database. We looked at, we only include papers when they discuss the model. So not review papers when they say talk about models, but actually they presented the model, a new model or a new variation of a model. And then we looked at, is the code available and how did they document their work? So the paper on this will be published soon in Environmental Modeling and Software, but I provide you some kind of some summary results. So in this figure, you see that over time, and this might be a little bit confusing figure because there are two trends. So one is that we get an increasing number of publications over time, which might be the increasing use of the keywords, agent-based and individual-based modeling. That's one, but also we get more people using simulations. And then the share of those papers who share their code, and there are different ways of sharing, which I come to later, is also increasing. So we have a kind of a very rapid number of increasing amount of code available. But in 2018, which is the last complete year that we had, it's still only 20%. So there's still a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of variation between journals, as we will see later. So this is partly because in the beginning, well, a lot of us, like me, who are not trained in computer science, we didn't really think about a lot of these issues about best practices, and we would know that that in 20 years somebody wants to do something with your work, which happened to me. That was not something I was anticipating when I was publishing my work. And indeed, making the code available is not just the holy grail of what we do, but I like to, if I have my students, that some of them might also be online, if I want them to work on your work, and also myself, I want to build on somebody else's work, and I want to see what others have been doing. That's why the frustration started when I actually also did my graduate studies, when I tried to find out what other people did, and I could not get access to the code. And even if I contacted authors, they didn't provide it. So it's frustrating that you want to build on the work of others, but it's not available. So partly is not having good enough practices. There are also intellectual property right issues, but sponsors now are requiring, but still they are not enforcing it. I know from the National Science Foundation that sponsors a lot of my work. If we ask about enforcement, they say, well, yeah, that might happen in our spare time. So they don't really have any resources to enforce any kind of commitments that people make. So where do people share their code? On their personal website, which is really a bad choice because those disappear. The journal, which can be behind a paywall, so that's also not really a good idea. So really the best way to do that is in a public archive. So that's the lower bar, and we see an increase, but it's not sufficient. Say only 5% is sharing their code in a public archive, and we will give some examples what those are. So repository is something like GitHub, which is nice but not sufficient, because which version has been used, and with a repository like GitHub, you can still kind of delete your stuff. An archive is something that is permanent in computer kind of terms. So there are differences in the kind of ways people share their work. So we would like to see more people sharing their code in public archives. So there are major differences between journals. Let's see, I know Flaminio likes to see the high percentage in Jazz, and Jazz is also working with us. Well, Flaminio is now on the board also of ComsNet. So, but some journals publish a lot about agent-based modeling and individual-based modeling and have no code available, which is probably they may argue that everything is there because they provided all the equations. Being a mathematician originally myself, I know that that's not sufficient, because even the documentation in mathematics might not be correct in your paper, and it might still also not be sufficient for knowing what somebody actually has done to create the numerical outcome. So there are major differences, probably also in norms. So this is not a technical problem. The places to archive your work are there. There might be better standards. There might be easier to use platforms, but it's largely a social problem. And that's, I think, one of the major challenges. That's why we have to get collaboration from journals and publishers. So, this is kind of a snapshot of all these papers in different fields. We looked at are there differences between fields in what software they use or what kind of documentation practices? Well, the ODD is largely used in ecology, but there is not really much differences in practices about sharing code and the kind of software that is used. Because of the individual based modeling is a large emphasis on ecology in this figure. So now I want to focus on what are journals starting to do. So we see, so maybe I should pause. I see that there is communication, but in the chat, but I don't know whether there's something that is directly addressed to me now.
I don't.
Is there something I need to address now?
No,
or?
not yet. Not yet.
Okay. So journals start to address the, often journals start to address issues about making your data available. I share here a statement from PNAS. And as I mentioned, the journal Ecology and Society, I'm the editor-in-chief of now. We also did that. It was something I wanted to do when I took that over. To my surprise, a lot of people do not understand what is data and why we should do that and and how to do that. I'm very surprised. There's a complete illiteracy among authors or kind of people may not want to be bothered by this, but journals will, like PNAS, they can put in more of those requirements, because if you want to publish there, yeah, you try to do everything that's needed to do that. So we see really a leadership, typically with journals who have higher impact factors, but we start also seeing that for other journals. Yes, it's extra work. But it also provides better quality of the work, and it also impacts the review process. I know for some journals in economics, they have a kind of a special editor who is kind of reproducing the statistical analysis of papers that are in review. So there are many issues with it, and I want to I want to address a few. So of course there are a lot of issues in terms of if you use human subject data. Not everything can be available. We are not people are not expecting you share the personal recordings of your interviews. So this is data that deals with is approved by your ethics committee, which you typically have an agreement on if you do human subjects research. And also FAIR, that I think Alan may talk about, that becomes a standard findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. So there are principles about sharing your data, and code is data too. But often we explicitly include that now because people may think code is not data. And then we want to share this in public repositories approved by the community, and there is a lot. There's a lot of that out there. So PNAS has a repository of repositories. I will share with you one that we maintain at ComSys. We have also a repository for model code, or a repository of repositories. So, and one of the main things is that we can build on the work of others. It's not that we are policing what you have done is correct. I think most reviewers will not check the details of your submission. So to share the code, you can do it, as I said, personal website of the journal. those are not really good ideas. If you look at the GitHub, it might be, some journals will probably be okay with that, but not a gold standard. We think more about this archives where you kind of permanently archive your data and you get a DOI. So we, with the open science framework, we developed a badge, which now some journals start to adopt. And we also have discussions with a major publisher who is interested to adopt this for some of their journals. That if that's happening, then that will be great, because we need to get those kind of publishing houses adopting. So the journals may, in a way, have to apply this themselves, but we provide kind of, have a coordinated sign of approval of that you can signal you do best practices. Very briefly about documentation standards. We also, there is a lot of challenges with documentation. Good documentation is not sufficient, and code itself is also not sufficient. You have to have both documentation and code. Within the social simulation community, we start, a lot of us start using ODD and variations of ODD, but there are a lot of challenges with ODD. And this was also in a recent paper that came out in JAS. A lot of people, they say they use the ODD, but don't really provide a good documentation. So that's kind of a challenge. So using the kind of the items of the ODD is not a kind of guarantee for doing good documentation. A lot of people provide a narrative and don't provide details of the model. So lots of, also I think more training may need to be done. I know that Volker would like to see kind of a certification that people get training in doing this. ODD is not the kind of golden standard for everything. Sorry, Volker, but within the Open Modeling Foundation, which Michael will talk later about, we try to get to minimum documentation standards among the kind of the broader community and of people doing computational models. So I would like to, we will see that later, the website. But I would like to, are there now any issues that that might be good to address? I see that Gary is old, but I don't know whether any other issues. Or should I go to try to provide a demo with the COMSIS? I can provide a little overview of things that happen in the, if we do upload a model in the COMSIS library. So we have about 800 in the library. This is to be sure that this is not that we want to spend a lot of our time in that to make it is if our goal was that this will be obsolete, that other tools will be available that do what we want to do, but currently they are not there. Let's go to, I want to share archive a model. And we, just to get an idea of what is needed, I will provide here a title. I will just make something up and a description. And that's basically a kind of an abstract. So there's some basic metadata, and we can indicate whether this is a replication or existing model. So actually I have also, it doesn't have to relate to a journal article. I have students replicating models of other papers, and they also archive it here, and that's a publication. So it might be associated with a publication, and you might have references. And this might also happen during the review process. So it's not public. You have to indicate when it is public. So you can have you can share this as part of the review process. So you can add some tags, and you may indicate where the GitHub or other repository is where you do your kind of the version control. So the archive is something which is more kind of permanent. That's okay. This is the version I use for my publication. Let's see. I'll go to the next. So now I will be asked to add some information. Of course, there is a risk of doing this live, but so let's go back. So I will have, I can add also contributors. I don't have to just to be me. So, and I have my, I can also have an embargo date operating system. Not all software runs on all the operating systems. I can indicate what languages is being used. Licenses, we provide options for licenses. This will be good to, in a way, Alan will talk a little bit about licenses later. So, and the uploading, we ask you to upload the source code. So that will be something that is a required option. Let's see whether I will just have a model here that I upload. It could also be a zip file of all kind of code. It could be you want to have a narrative. Of course, I don't really have a narrative directly present. So let's see whether I can I just put a slide here? That should not allow me. Yeah. So yes, so it will not allow you to do this, but so we want to have an actual, because some people try to be like me to not to have an actual model documentation, and you can upload some data, and then you can have also outputs. So if you all have done that, you can publish it. So I'm not ready yet to publish, but I could publish it. And then you are also asked, are you sure? Because once it published, it's out there, and it cannot be removed. You cannot say, and I want to have make a tweak. No, you have to be sure that it's published. You don't have to publish it until you're ready to do so. You can share a link. You can also request peer review, which is basically that somebody will check some basic things. We are not checking whether your model is correct. We check whether we can run the model, whether, which surprisingly is often not the case, whether there is reasonable model documentation, and reasonable means that there seems to be sufficient detail to get an idea of what are the underlying assumptions, what are the underlying processes, and that there is code that has been somewhat cleaned up and provide some comments to get an idea of what it is doing. So it's not, the peer review is not, is the model correct, but is it some basic principles of good practice that somebody understand what is going on. So you don't have to do that. And we have people who dump their data without good practices, which is fine. We accept that. But if you want to get a stamp of peer review, and you may see that if you go to the library, you will see, actually, I think you can also sort on peer reviewed. So, so you get the journals will have gone through the peer reviewed. So at least the version that we have checked, they run and that met the good standards. So I want to now, in a way, make a pause to see whether there are some more things to discuss. Let's see whether there are some questions. So people may wonder one of the goals of ComSys is to make it relatively easy to do. GitHub is great, but it's not everybody. It's not really the most accessible kind of platform for people. So you can do all of your work in GitHub. And we are not necessarily arguing that you have to archive your work in our library. You can use all kind of, also if you use GitHub, you can make a Zenodo kind of put in the Zenodo archive. But if you want to put the version for the long term, and make that available, then that's why we would recommend archive like ComSys.
Marco, can I jump in just for a second?
Yes.
I just want to emphasize something that where GitHub is a development environment, and that's great. ComSys doesn't intend to be a development environment, but the goal is to try a place where you publish your model for a particular research project as a record of that actual research, rather than a place where you can do shared development. So it's a little bit different goal on this. And it's a place where someone can say, oh, I find this research really interesting. How did people do that? And what did they do? Now you can go and see what they did and hopefully learn and understand it and build on that is the goal of this. Yeah.
And a lot of people use this also for searching. We had about 50,000 downloads last year for models, so people are using it. Yeah. So any questions or comments on the model sharing? Yes, there is much more that we could do in terms of model sharing. Code is a start. So that's part of the challenge, that a lot of us are more, well, say we might be more advanced and we want to require more. But if we look at just at what people are doing, and most people are not even sharing the code, let alone the whole kind of workflow. And that's actually something that we also, and maybe Alan will mention some of that, we also are interested in kind of archiving the whole workflow in a way. That's there's much more that could be done, but those are more advanced type steps. And I think to get also a stimulus for people to, we have to have different steps. So one of the low-hanging fruits is just share your code. And that will be already good if people do that. And if more people start doing that, then a lot of more things could fall out of that too.
And our library has evolved from initially just making it possible for you to share your code to now, if you share your code, you're required to put something in the documentation. And then subsequently, now we have options so that you can share your results and your input data. So we're moving towards trying to capture the pieces of an entire workflow. It's more complicated than it seems, but our library has started to evolve to try and capture those things. because it's you know, Stephen and others are right. That's really important.
So I'm not sure what I understand Patrick's question.
Well, I mean, I can see Patrick's question and answer it. And so one can make a method available, think of the model as the method, without necessarily providing the entire workflow. But it's much easier to learn how to use the method, to use the tool, if you do have the workflow. So, I mean, I can see how you can split it, and people do, but that doesn't mean that that's the best thing. And I think if we're trying to write models for others, we need to think about how to make them more accessible and more understandable and more reusable. And so that means we need to somehow provide the kind of information necessary so that people don't just have the code, but can learn how to use it. So, I mean, I agree. This is an evolution.
Yeah, and there are quite a lot of differences. I was at I think this was the Winter Simulation conference that I attended a few years ago, and there was also a session about reproducibility and code availability. And a lot of the participants are working in kind of more as consultants, and also a lot of health-related data. Yeah, their sponsors specifically asked them not to share the code. So, but that's in a way, they may also not, how much is this science that is publishable in a scientific journal if they do consultancy? That's all fine. But yes, there are a lot of potential restrictions also with not all the data and methods could be always shared, but it's surprising. But provide then a reason for it instead of by default you don't share your work. It's the default you don't share your work. It might be that by default you share, and if you have a good reason, you say, okay, I cannot do this, and I think the people will be accommodating that. But it's it's frustrating given that in some fields sharing your work is so common. Say I also do experimental work, behavioral experiments. You immediately are sent back your paper if you want to publish your work on experiments, and you don't share all the protocol and your workflow of data analysis. It's just not possible to get published in good journals. So so that's kind of the norms have changed, and in psychology now they start to work on you have to pre-register your experiment. So there are a lot of issues with that too, but norms are changing, and I think that's what it should be common that we are sharing our work. And if you don't want to, then there might be a good reason for it, and then you may indicate why it is the case. Yeah, the trace is a good way to So
I said, emphasize what Marco says is that all these are great and we should all do these things. But right now, it's nobody even shares the code, and so we need to get that going. And then, of course, we need to have people think about it in terms of total best practices for sharing knowledge and understanding.
Yeah, and there is some great work also in computer science that a colleague from University of Arizona did that too. He and the students contacted authors of people who present in various conferences and try to get their code and get it to run and get the same results. They were very unsuccessful with that. And even if that was, the reason why they did the study is that they were so frustrated by an incident that they did not got the code of a colleague, although in the original grant of NSF, they said they will make their code available. And so they were then doing this study, and that was kind of embarrassing that even if the code was shared, often the results were not there. So yes, and this is also a problem in computer science itself. It's not, well, I'm not a computer science, I am using computation, but and I think a lot of us are not computer scientists itself. So, but tools become available, but we also have to change our norms. Okay, I now think we should move to Alan to keep on the schedule.
And I'll drop out at 9 o'clock for this other meeting, and then come back in and tell me when.
Okay. Alan? I'm not sure whether Alan
can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. And everyone can see the slides?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so thank you, Michael and Marco, for the introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some specific parts of preparing software for future comprehension reuse, particularly related to software metadata. There's already been some discussion in the chat about what things are needed. It's not just the code. That's a very good point that's been raised. So in order to help others find, access, understand, reuse your code, including your future self, you need to have more than just a code dump. As anyone who has tried to spelunk old model code has probably encountered, it's extremely difficult. Reading code is a very different skill than writing code, and oftentimes we write code in ways that we would not write 5 years from now, when methods have changed and you have more experience with the modeling toolkit or even the problem domain that you're in. So how can we prepare software archives that facilitate these goals? Well, it's more about the metadata, the things that you use to describe your model. So the narrative documentation. This is not just the publication that accompanies your model. This is tailored specifically to your model itself. So ODD, trace, the trace style lab notebooks. These are useful examples. Other metadata include the software and data dependencies with versions that your model requires. So we'll talk more about this in the containerization section. So there are ways to capture the entire computational environment that you used, that was used when a model produced the results that you ended up analyzing. There are platforms that handle this now, and well, they may preserve your model into perpetuity or 5 years, whichever comes first. But in the meantime, that's why archives are probably your best bet for preserving your work. Then there's licensing. You have to create a license to govern use of your code. The final thing I wanted to talk about is citations. So citing your own code is becoming a norm, and it's probably an important and well, a critical change that needs to happen in the practice in the field. So the Force 11 community has established some software citation principles and created some tools and metadata around them for citing your code. The main points I want to get across is that you should include version information in your citation. You should use permanent identifiers where possible. These could be DOIs. They could also be permanent URL, something that resolves to a landing page that then provides additional context or metadata about the software. And the code should preferably be published in a trusted DOI issuing digital repository. There's been a lot of conversation about what constitutes a trusted digital repository. As I mentioned earlier, it either lasts forever or 5 years, whichever comes first. But in the meantime, most trusted digital repositories will have a backup plan, some way to transition their materials and the metadata that were entrusted to them onto a more permanent place, or, well, the next more permanent place. So here are some examples of software citations that ComSys provides and Zenodo provide. And if there's any questions, please feel free to shoot your hand up or interrupt me. Licensing is extremely important. It's not just mundane sort of administrivia. You have to have a license in order to allow people to use your work. It protects you, it protects the people that use the software. There's two primary types of license. There's the viral license. It's probably not an appropriate term in this day and age now, but that's the GNU GPL or AGPL. This license forces anyone who uses your software to also release their changes as open source. It doesn't, well, of course it doesn't force them, but it legally requires them to. So the difference between the GPL and the AGPL is minor. The AGPL simply states that if you offer your software as a service, for instance, if your model runs on a server somewhere and is offered as a service that people can invoke, then the AGPL covers that usage as well. Permissive licenses like the MIT Apache BSD licenses are more about protecting attribution and allow for any use, commercial, non-commercial. They can do whatever they want with the code. So in general, the recommended practice is just to use the license preferred by the community. Licenses can be incompatible with each other. So if your software uses a GPL library, then your software has to be GPL as well. That's the viral nature of it. So if you have a permissive license, then anybody can use your software however they want. They could use it in the GPL project. It can be a little bit tricky, but I don't want to get bogged down in those details. So for the most part, I think it's best to, again, just let the community decide. Eventually people will sort of transition to the license that makes the most sense for the community. It's one of those emergent properties. Marco already talked about the Open Science Badge, so I'm gonna skip through this. But this is primarily a way to signal that from a journal's perspective, or even from your own, if you have a blog or some kind of newsletter or whatever, in your own content, if you want to link to a model that has passed the standards established by the Open Code Badge, then you can create this link to it. And the ComSys Model Library offers some convenient ways to copy, cut, and paste the HTML or the markdown that's used to generate the badge. So I'll move on to containerization. There have been several initiatives to construct sort of these reproducible computational environments. I believe Nature is partnering with CodeOcean. You can create code capsules, and these are sort of fully self-contained computational environments that capture the entire pipeline, the entire workflow of your computational artifacts. And they also they allow you to archive and export these code capsules into Docker, for instance. And I'll describe Docker in more detail in the following slides. But computational tails at Wholetail are another effort along these same lines. Wholetail is an NSF-funded endeavor. The United States National Science Foundation funded endeavor. CodeOcean is a private startup. And containerization is kind of the secret sauce behind both of these platforms. So the important part of containerization is that it represents sort of a platform agnostic way of and portable way of transporting your computational environments. So containerization starts with if we're using Docker as an example, and Docker is not the only way to create a container, but it's the one that we'll focus on in this portion. It's a recipe. So you can think it's just a simple text file A Docker file is a simple text file, and it contains a list of instructions that's needed to create a virtual environment, a container that has all of your dependencies in it, all of the things that are needed to make your model run. So that would include your modeling platform, it would include your model code, it would include your data dependencies, if you have any other software or library dependencies that you needed. The base operating system that's running on, let's say if it was Linux, it might be Ubuntu 18.04 or Red Hat. So one thing to note is that Docker files they're primarily Linux based. So they can run on Windows and the Mac, but the image itself is really a Linux image. A Docker image, so the Docker file is this recipe to build a Docker image, and the Docker container is a running instance of your image. These containers are runnable within sort of an interpretive runtime, this container runtime. That container runtime is not managed by Docker. There is an open source consortium called the Open Container Initiative, which is not dedicated to drinking and driving, but instead is dedicated to ensuring that these containers will be interoperable and compatible in the long term. So just to fully to reiterate the difference between Docker images and containers, this is an image from my 9-year-old. A Docker image is essentially, you can think of it as the idea, but it's just a file. It's a file, it's a zipped up archive that contains all of the things necessary to build a running instance. Your container is the running instance. So we have started a few other containerization tutorials for common modeling frameworks. So Manuela has created these tutorials on our forums for containerizing NetLogo models, both GUI versions and in headless mode, and as well as for R. So one of the benefits of containerization is that it allows you to have this reproducible computational environment. It does help with transporting your model. Let's say you have 6 developers all working on the same model. You're not going to experience, if everyone is running the model within the container, they will not have an experience where someone is using a different version of a library than another person. You have a consistent onboarding experience. You have a consistent way to refer to the model and fix bugs with it. So this is one of the things that we're interested in at ConsciousNet in the future is facilitating containerization of models and seeing when we freeze this snapshot of your model, can we create an image that captures all of the essential pieces of your model so that when you actually run it again, you will see the exact results that were. This is getting at exact computational reproducibility. Of course, it doesn't get at comprehension. That's covered by the software metadata side, the accompanying documentation. So that's all I have to talk about. There's some additional resources, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Alan. There is a question about Jupyter notebooks. How does that relate to containerization? Oh,
sure. So a Jupyter notebook is that is separate from containerization. It's another format. Essentially a Jupyter notebook is a text file. It's a pile of what's called JSON, if you're familiar with the term JSON. It's basically a JavaScript data structure that has all of the code and context within it that you've written in it. It's not. They're completely separate in this case. So a Jupyter notebook can be interpreted by a Jupyter server and be executed. So that's I guess in one sense they are similar in that they're both executable environments. Actually working with the American Geophysical Union data director and a group an international group there to establish sort of journal guidance on executable environments, and so that will be forthcoming in the next few months. Yes, I'd be happy to share the slides.
Yeah, I'm putting that now also in the. Okay, so what are some other questions? So how, because Docker is not the only platform that's out there. So I think there are different kinds of containerizations, and there are also developments of making those easier to do that. You can just plop your model in with some kind of description of what other software you use. Now it seems to be quite it's quite some effort you have to do to containerize your work.
Yes, it's a lot of work, and it's easy to actually create Docker containers that are not maintainable in the future. So a Docker file recipe would say things like find me these software packages, but those software packages might not, those are URLs, and those URLs may not exist anymore 3 or 4 years down the road. So it might be possible to build in a Docker file, this recipe, that no longer is no longer capable of building images. Like the image creation fails, but you can archive the image itself, and the image itself should be run that's already captured all of the initial dependencies that were at the time of its creation. So that image itself should be runnable by the container runtime. And so far things have been backwards compatible, but there's no guarantee for the future, of course. I think the main thing that the Docker file presents, though, is a transparency. You're explicitly listing all of the dependencies in your project. Now, it's not an ideal way of listing your dependencies, because it can still be quite difficult to read, and make sense of. But at least it's plain text, and enough experience it is possible to parse. Other container formats, there's one called Singularity, and that's if you interact with a high performance computing system, that's typically what you will engage with. But there's tools that convert from Singularity images to Docker images, and that's a fairly straightforward process. There are tools out there that can look at your code and automatically generate a Docker file, or it's a close approximation of a Docker file that would be relevant for your code. That we've been exploring, integrating with at ComSysNet. These are still emerging works in progress. So, but right now, containerization is kind of like the plumbing, and I expect better tooling to emerge as a result in the next few years.
So, are there other questions? So one benefit of containerization is also that you may be easier to use that kind of code and run it on, say, high performance computing. At least that's the idea. There are some, I know that there are some challenges, but that's, I think, in a number of fields, people provide now containers instead of the model code, because it basically has all these dependencies. Is that correct?
That's right. So a container is essentially, it can also be viewed as a very lightweight virtual machine. Yeah. And so the this virtual machine doesn't have, like a normal virtual machine might take 700 or 800 megabytes of space and take a while to spin up. It's starting a lot of unnecessary things. So that's all stripped down, and that's the main technological improvement for containers over virtual machines. It's more like an apartment room versus an entire, a standalone house. A room in an apartment in an apartment complex versus a standalone house. They're sharing the plumbing of your and all the infrastructure the building. There is no guarantee that we'll be able to run containers in 20 years. But as I said, it's a better path forward in that the process of constructing the container helps to clarify your what dependencies you have. And one nice thing about containers is that there's a process in software engineering that we call continuous integration, where every time you make a change to the code, something automatically tries to compile your code, build it and execute it, and maybe run a set of automated tests across your code that provide, take your acceptable inputs and provide the expected outputs. Containerization is a similar exercise to building continuous integration, and they can often lead easily from one to the other. So it's not really that the containerization is the final end goal. It's more that the process of doing so is good for your code and your development process.
Okay. Any last question? So
great. Thanks for your time.
Yeah. Then we go back to Michael, because you can imagine that there is a lot of things that, as some of you indicated, there's a lot of things to do, and there's a lot of differences between for those who are just starting and those who are more advanced, and who are we to define any standards. So that's what Michael Barton has been leading the last few years to get to a kind of an organization of organizations, and trying to collaborate among organizations to think about standards that could be used. Michael, I will give the floor back to you. No, and I will let you know. Let me know if you go to the next slide.
And I have more than one slide, but I'm going to start out with this a little bit here. So I've had to be out of the discussion here for the last 20, 30 minutes, so I can't see the chat, but I was following it previously. I left off with the idea that we need kind of a combination of technology, but we also face a social challenge, and that's come up, is that how can people learn how to use models appropriately? How can we get the knowledge to engage in best practices? How can we incentivize people to do this? I mean, it's extra work. The meetings that I talked about that kind of started us talking about the future of modeling, thought about next generation modeling. A number of us, after several years of this, began to think, meetings are great and we're having fun going to these workshops, but it'd be great if we actually did something too. What can we actually do to try and move this effort ahead? And so we took advantage of, and I'm going to switch here. I don't know, so let me see here if I can. Okay, there's one slide. Can you see the next slide,
yeah.
Marco?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. And so how can we actually somehow get modelers to kind of begin to think about these new best practices? How can we do it across multiple scientific fields, across multiple communities in many places? How can we provide incentives? And the thought was, so a number of modeling organizations got together at a kind of an informal meeting to talk about this. And we did some on email, and we actually met. And so what we need is some kind of a set of institutions, norms, rules, and organization to develop the standards, software standards for modeling best practices, right? So what are these standards, and can we, how can we develop these? How can we tell people about them? How can we communicate them? How can we actually administer them to be able to evaluate modeling to see if it conforms to standards or not, and somehow certify this so that it communicates to the world that a particular modeling scientist is trying to do the right thing? How do we provide, make available education, training, and actually incentives? Because all this stuff, whether it's better documentation or containerization or writing better model code, takes work. And if you're only being paid to get a result and no one cares about anything else, even if you're very altruistic and really care about these, it's hard to find time when there's so many other pressures in your time. So what kind of professional incentives can be provided to do this? And this requires some kind of coordination. And importantly, I think to have standards that are acceptable to a community, there needs to be kind of community developed standards. It's not like one group imposing Betamax on everybody in the world. Right? So we need to say, how can we come up with cross-disciplinary standards that are useful and acceptable and promoted with everybody? And so the idea of creating this meta-organization, an organization of organizations, a consortium, if you were, called the Open Modeling Foundation, emerged. And so this got to kind of put this together at a meeting back in June of 2018. And so what I'm going to show here, this is like part of the mission statement that we drafted then, and we've modeled and we've modified a little bit. But the idea is this international open science community, right, to try and enable next generation modeling, but to do so by kind of coming up with, coordinating, administering these common community-wide body of standards and best practices across these different communities. That would make models more easily findable and accessible, more reproducible, more reusable, more interoperable, more understandable. And so can we try and create some kind of an organization that would accomplish this? And so we've been working since this time. Now, can you see, I shifted slide. Can you see a table?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, good. Well, maybe this is all working. This is just, since this time, we've started holding meetings to both come up with plans for how to do this, to try and develop an organizational structure that would make it work, and to communicate the idea of this initiative to multiple communities. The first major meeting was back in May, a little over a year ago, outside of Berlin at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies. There was another one in Canberra, Australia in December. We were supposed to have one in Boulder, Colorado this spring. That got moved online. That one we held. And then we also are planning one that's coming up in early October. And this latter group, we managed to get, so far we haven't been able to get funding from NSF, National Science Foundation, but we have money from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to support some of this work. Small money, but still useful on this. So it's been really good to have. So here's some of the things we've been trying to do. So we are trying to create an organization, but we also recognize that it's good to have exemplars. So, several different groups are trying to develop examples of coupled modeling environments so we can see what the advantage of having standards-based modeling is in terms of clear code, documentation, reusability, and common APIs. One effort is going on with ComSysNet, CSDMS, and the crop modeling DSAT group, and that's supported by Sloan Foundation. Another initiative is being headed by Mark Roncevelle out of Ames, Analysis, Integration, and Modeling of the Earth System, and the Global Land Project to develop kind of coupled large-scale behavioral models of land use that could be associated with biophysical models. We have a paper that came out on Earth System Dynamics on model coupling a year ago, 2 years ago, 2018, if you want to take a look at that. As Marco mentioned earlier, we've developed an open code badge. Now we're trying to come up with ways to help people understand containerization that Alan just talked about. We've got tutorials that are available. CSDMS has been actively trying to design an exemplar common API and ontology, especially for geophysical or science models, but to extend to social science models. And they just came out with a version 2 of BMI, that's Basic Model Interface, which is a wrapper, and we're trying to actually utilize that in our coupled modeling project to bring together climate, water, and crops. And then an interesting kind of an aside, a whole group of people involved in this initiative, plus even more, put an open letter into the journal Science in May calling for model transparency in the COVID pandemic. And that seems to be getting a lot of citation, a lot of interest. Very short, but like 32 organizations collaborated on that. So that's the idea. We're trying to build this international cooperation. And then in addition to just the meetings, we're actually trying to build a collaboration environment, a platform. We're going to do it anyway if this is an international organization, but the pandemic has made it even more essential we do so that we can work together to both develop and operationalize an international organization and start to create standards. So we've started out building on GitHub and a collaboration platform both for governance and standards making. And we speedily got a version of this out so that we could try it out at the May workshop, and it worked successfully. Here's sort of what it looks like. This is the page for one of the pages for governance, and it gives you the opportunity to see a document, and then using the GitHub issue tracker, which we're using these, you can make comments or ideas and things like that, and then you can even suggest edits to a document, which in GitHub language is a pull request. And so we use this to start building this organizational data, and you can take a look at it and then build standards. So we have, as Marco mentioned earlier, minimal standards, kind of at a big picture, what's the goal of standards for accessibility, what's the goal of standards for reproducibility and so forth. And this is something we can take what we did in the first workshop now in this platform, and we'll take it into the second workshop, and a new group of people, rather than starting over again, will be able to build, we hope, on the work that we've done previously. We hope to have a third workshop coming up in the spring of 2021, and maybe more after that. But then this will continue to be a place to develop these. And we see minimal standards and then eventually implementation standards. So for example, for documentation, what's the goal of good documentation? And then we might have various ways, implementation standards like ODD and others that can meet those minimal standards in appropriate ways. And the idea is to come up with a set of standard document and then send it out to request for comment to the broader community, have comments, have a period of editing, respond to the comments, and then have an organization that can put it to a vote and adopt this, and then disseminate it to the community, and then award some kind of a public certification or a recognition, whether it's a badge or something else, so that other people know that this model, this code, and this research attempts to be standards-based and following community best practices. And this is what we don't want. I'll wind up here. And so we don't want to just add yet more standards to many that are out there now. We want to make this a community effort that can bring these things together rather than balkanize the idea of standards. So you can't see this slide. It's my funny slide at the end. I hope you can see this.
Yeah, we see this.
Thank goodness. Thank goodness. I hate to miss this one. Let me then unshare my screen for a minute here. If I can move this around. I'll stay on for a little bit here for any comments and questions and things.
So Jerome has a question.
Actually, that's more of an answer, I think.
Okay. So any questions on the Open Modeling Foundation, or just in general? It will be good to broaden it up to the discussion.
Yeah, I think now it's discussion time for the remainder of the period here.
Yeah.
So I have to go back for another meeting, but I can stay on here. Other people can, of course, answer, but I can, answer any questions or respond to any comments at this point. And unfortunately, I can't see hands or anything. I think people will sort of just have to speak up.
There are no hands raised. Yeah. So we should, whether there should be a mini conference on this topic, inviting all ABM communities spread in many fields. So,
that's what we're trying to do with the workshops, is bring in a dozen, 20, actually the first one had 30 or 40 participants. The one that's coming up will probably have 25 or 30 participants from multiple groups.
Yeah, they are not all agent-based modeling communities, but they are doing computational models. We also have a yearly winter school in which we bring some of those practices in. And we are now, of course, going online too. So that might be a way also to scale up. Because I think an important part will be to improve training abilities.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's why we are looking for funding to provide modules to learn people the various best practices and get feedback.
And we want to communicate this initiative to as many people as possible in the modeling community. That's part of the reason we're bringing it up here in this tutorial, for a nice number of participants. But I think, it will be good ultimately, as we begin to build this out, to have mini conferences, to be able to talk about this in a number of the modeling organizations that are participating. There are a lot of them, including Environmental Modeling and Software Society, the Society for Ecological Modeling, there's System Dynamics Society. There's a lot of societies that are participating in this, and we're hoping to we can use those venues to communicate to a very broad audience. Because it's better if we can include as many modeling stakeholders, people who are developing models, as well as people who are using them, the better off we are.
Yeah, and for those who are teaching, it will be good to raise these issues also in their courses, because I think a lot of us are trying to figure out things on our own. And it would be good to have students getting familiar with some of the basic places to find information. So yeah, I think it should become part of that. That's one of the reasons to get funding to provide teaching material coming out of the Open Modeling Foundation. And so that I think there are a lot of ways to do that, but it also requires some funding. Are there actors from industry involved in the OMF? That's a good question.
There are some people, and that we've been trying to get people to identify potential participants in the workshops. The focus at the moment has been on to try and find representatives of organizations. But moving ahead, so I'll back up a minute. Part of the vision right now of the OMF is to have organizations, be the members. So the members of OMF or Open Modeling Foundation are organizations of modelers. But then actually a lot of the business of the Open Modeling Foundation will take place in working groups, and individuals can be members of working groups. And so we're trying to both identify organizations that can serve as members of this meta organization, and at the same time find interested individuals, including like ones from industry and elsewhere, who can be active members of working groups that to both develop standards, develop cyber infrastructure, develop education materials and training and things like that.
Okay, I see there is a hand of one.
I'm new in the community, so I just wanted to know a little bit about if this is the first, like inspired by your last slide, is this the first time that there has been an effort of a overarching organization trying to make this protocol, and and what has been the insights of those processes, if this is new or not?
As far as we know, this is the first initiative like this. There have been particular groups, OpenMI and some others, who have come up with a protocol which they've wanted to make universal across many modeling organizations. CSDMS, same way with BMI. In general, those have, while they've been used, it has not been successful because the modeling community is very dispersed into many different micro communities in different areas. And so this was an alternative to say, okay, rather than we come up with a standard and then try to get everybody to adopt it, let's get as many groups together as possible, organizations that represent lots of individuals, and have them come up with the standards, and then maybe we can get them much more broadly adopted if everybody feels like they have a stake in it. But there's another ulterior motive, and if we can get enough representation of modelers, thousands and thousands of them, then we can start to provide incentives for utilizing these standards, because those incentives, the kind of incentives we all respond to are ones for professional advancement, for career advancement. At universities, what counts for tenure and promotion, and research organizations, similar kinds of things, right? And so right now we get recognition for publishing papers in certain kinds of journals, right? And so then there are committees that look at those and they judge us, right? So how do we get it so doing models and publishing models and doing them well with documentation, with workflows, actually gets the same kind of incentives, that you get promoted, that you get pay raises for this? Well, we have to change what the committees look at. And if it's just one organization, ComSys or anybody else trying to do this, we don't have much leverage. But if we can get a dozen or 24 organizations that represent 10,000 or 15,000 modelers around the world, then a lot of those people serve on those committees and make those rules. And then we can begin to make changes in these incentives so that people feel like, oh, I've got to do it the right way so I can get a certification code, or my model won't count, or it won't be cited by other people, or it won't be downloaded. And so part of it is just building up enough scale to make these incentives possible. That's the other side of it.
If I can then ask another question, because if you are trying to upscale or grow this organization, how have you been thinking about the voting or the democratic aspect of an organization that is going to include so many people and so many decisions?
That's what, if you look at the charter, that's what we're trying to work out. That's what we're trying to work out in these workshops right now, is how do we vote on this thing? And that's, I think it's still a little bit up in the air. If you look at the charter, look at the issue tracker, there were a lot of discussion of that at the last workshop. And so, do we have, it's quite an envision right now, there's a members council where all organizations have a vote of some kind, but probably also a smaller committee that's made up of representatives of different groups to manage things. There are some models to follow. Open Geospatial Consortium, OGC, is something that grew from the Open Grass Foundation many years ago, and now it's an enormous organization for standards in geospatial technologies. And actually, I'm in contact with people from OGC, and one of them is the head of their science board is going to be attending the workshop in October to provide advice and thoughts of how they think we can do this. So I think it's a really important question, and it's something we really need to work out on this. But we'd like to have the community help develop those ideas so that people feel like that their voice is heard. Obviously we can't just have everybody in the world having a big vote on things, but we need to have some kind of way so that all modelers that are part of this feel like their voice is or can be heard, either through a working group or as part of an organization or something else. That's key. Yeah,
and those are we focus on minimum kind of standards because that's what we may all agree upon, and individual organizations may have additional requirements that they would like to see for their members. So so that's some of the challenge that a lot of us may want to have additional issues, but we need to agree on some of the minimal principles. That's, I think, important. And that those will be adopted.
I'm going to have to drop back out now, but you guys can finish this off then. Yes. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Michael. So additional questions related to the kind of work we shared about code sharing, documentation, or any other issues you will like to discuss related to making your work kind of available for your future self and others. To be honest, I'm surprised. I thought I did a good job in the past, but it's certainly has not been the case. I was not focused on those things. That's why I typically say to my students that I want them to learn the things that I all did wrong, so that if you want to go back to your own work, that you know what you have been doing. So if you write a documentation, also think about your future self. It's not only for other people, but in 10 years, do you know why you did certain things? And it's surprisingly that we often do things in a rush and may not think about a lot of the kind of the basic documentation. And there have been sufficient number of replication studies that shows that papers published in premier journals have difficulties to be replicated. So hopefully we will get to a change of some norms. As we saw that there is an increase of the adoption of sharing code, but much more needs to be done. Any additional? So I know that I probably about 10 years ago, I raised issues like this in this was at that time the ESSA conference, and some people were very upset about these ideas of sharing code, but now I don't get a rebellion. That was at our starting. When we started this work, people were upset about providing, because we should let everything go and not impose any kind of standards on people what to expect. So.
Yeah, it's that sometimes with this, I was thinking about the consensus and the open batch is how much could that become like I know that the idea is that peer reviewing is the way of preventing people to code wash and start just using the symbol as a way of washing or showing just that a symbol becomes the important and not then like because symbols become just badges, and then people start just using badges.
Yes,
for the sake of them, and
that's a good point. So there is some. There are. I mentioned that we work with the Open Science Framework, and they have created badges for open data. There were some protocols, and if you go to say the premier psychology journals, they now have implemented those, and so you see from publications what is there. And also I was at a conference last year with a lot of psychologists. In that presentation you see those badges and you know, okay, this is a pre-registered experiment and all the data is available. And so that's in a way it's signaling some norms. We will not micromanage how people are using that. So there is some risk involved that people may use it in ways that it's not intended. But I think but if that will happen, then that's also indicates that it seems to become important and people want to, in a way, cheat. And so. But I think now getting some publishers adopting this, because it's partly a technical issue that they have to change things for their journals. That's why with one journal that they want to do this, this is so if this major publisher will adopt it for one journal, it will be easy then to go to other journals. When we started this, we had the idea of starting our own journal. Luckily, we didn't do that. We explored the options. We want to have a journal with the best practices, but it's very time-consuming to start a new journal. And we don't know how successful that will be. But so we start reaching out to existing journals, and journals were very reluctant, especially those who are with commercial publishers, because they said, well, our publisher doesn't want us to do this. And so it's good that now we get some publishers, at least one publisher who may adopt this. And if that's happening, I think then that's key to get many more journals involved. And it might be, and learning, we may have to learn from that, what might be a best practice. And maybe there should be a data availability or code availability editor on the editorial board. Somebody will checks on those issues. So it's not that this is, you may have some expertise in dealing with those specific issues to implement that well. Any other questions?
Can I ask a last question? And that's,
yes.
And that's all for me. Is that I was in another seminar or open workshop on Tuesday about qualitative methods and how to integrate them to AVM. And one of the questions that I was dealing with is, okay, now we kind of have some protocols for coding, for codes, but then what's your thought about the protocols of transforming qualitative data into code? Because one thing is because you are kind of getting people's interviews and just messing with some sort of them with the meanings, and how would you feel in this type of standardization or protocols?
So I was not at that workshop. We are a 9-hour difference, so I'm not participating in a lot of this week, but I know I use a lot of qualitative work myself. Yes, this is, that's certainly a stand also because you deal with a lot of kind of personal information. There are some tools also for mental models. They are creating tools to standardize some of this work. But yes, there are, I think the key will be to describe as much as you could do without you may not fully replicate that process. I think that will be a challenge, but and every community may have its standards on what kind of protocols there are. Also with well, if I think about a lot of qualitative methods, they have still protocols. If you do surveys, there are kind of, we train people on how to do these surveys. The interpretation of the data to some algorithmic statements, that is largely might be the art of the modeler, and that might be difficult to that might be difficult to describe. But if there will be information about how the data is collected, I think that's a key point. As not all the data might be available. I was involved with a project with a lot of focus group discussions in Mexico City, and so a lot of the underlying data is not available, but then there is a process in how the data is analyzed, and then the final outcomes, that's what could be shared, but and it is shared with the readers about what has been the protocol, how is the data collected and how is it analyzed. So, so yes, I think there's a middle way in that. You cannot, the unique thing of code is that in principle, it should be repeatable, but that's not with all science. And we have to recognize that it's the case, but still we train people to, and we have protocols also for qualitative research. So, so that's what we can share.
Thank you.
Yeah, if there are any follow-up questions, then feel free to contact us. I know this is recorded, so you may, there were questions about some of the information we shared. Some have been posted in the chat. Others will be in the, well, when we post the recording, or at least the organizers of this Social Simulation Week. And you can always reach out to us. If you are a ComSys member, you will get a kind of a digest every 3 months. And we hold a number of different activities during the year. Like the winter school, we also have sometimes virtual conference. We didn't do it this year because we have a lot of other things on our plate. But yeah, be involved with this kind of activities and let your voice heard. Okay, thank you very much for attending, and I look forward to hear for any follow-ups. And thank you, Flaminio, to host this